History remembers kings who won wars and kings who lost thrones, but almost never a king who kept surviving death itself. Yet in the heart of 20th century Europe there was one ruler whom bullets kept missing, plots kept failing, and enemies kept underestimating his luck, his instincts, and his will to stay alive. This is not legend, not folklore, not palace myth. This is the documented life of King Zog I of Albania, a man who walked through years of conspiracies, coups, betrayals, and gunfire, and lived to tell the story before he even wore a crown, before he ruled a kingdom, before foreign newspapers called him the most endangered monarch in Europe. He was already marked by rivals in a country that barely existed as a state. Albania, after the First World War, was not a stable nation. It was a patchwork of clans, militias, foreign interests, and fragile governments. Power did not sit safely in parliaments, it moved with armed men, shifting loyalties and old blood feuds. And in this landscape a young political leader named Ahmet Zogu began climbing faster than anyone expected. He was born in 1895 into a powerful northern clan. He learned early that authority came from negotiation backed by force, and by his 20s he was already a key figure in Albanian politics, serving as Minister of the Interior, then Prime Minister, in a land where holding office often meant making enemies who preferred rifles to debates. Every reform he pushed, every alliance he formed, every rival he sidelined planted another reason for someone to want him gone, and the list grew quickly. Landowners who feared losing influence, political opponents who called him a tyrant, revolutionaries who saw him as an obstacle, and foreign powers watching Albania like a chessboard square in the Balkans. Long before he crowned himself king, he was living like a target, surrounded by bodyguards, changing routes, rarely sleeping in the same place twice. Yet even caution cannot stop every bullet, and in 1920, for inside the Albanian parliament itself, the unthinkable happened. A political opponent pulled a gun and fired at close range in the middle of a government building, turning a session of state into a scene of chaos. The attacker was Bakir Valteri, a man with political motives and a weapon in his hand. Zogu was hit, wounded, but not killed, and within moments Albania understood something chilling. This was not a rumor of danger, not whispers of a plot. Death had just walked into the parliament and failed. The survival of that day changed his life and his rule forever, because now politics was no longer only about speeches, alliances, or laws. It was about staying alive long enough to use them, and this was only the beginning. Enemies learned from failure, they organized better, they aimed more carefully, and they waited for moments when guards were fewer and distance was shorter. But so did Zog. He adapted, he hardened, he trusted less and prepared more. And as Albania moved toward monarchy, and he moved toward a crown, the question stopped being whether someone would try again and became when and where the next shot would come from, and how many times fate could bend before it finally broke. The gunshots in the parliament did not end Ahmet Zog. They transformed him. A wounded politician became a man who understood that power in Albania would never be separated from personal survival. After 1924 the country slid deeper into instability. Rival factions saw blood in the water, uprisings spread, and Zog was forced into temporary exile. Yet exile did not remove the threat, it only changed the distance between hunter and target, because from across borders he watched, plotted, negotiated, and prepared his return. In December 1924 he came back to Albania, backed by loyal forces and foreign support, and within weeks he re-established control, proving that being shot had not weakened him, it had clarified him. Albania now had a leader who ruled with the constant knowledge that hesitation could mean death. He strengthened internal security, expanded intelligence networks, and kept armed protection close at all times. But every new measure created new enemies. Former allies felt pushed aside. Opposition leaders accused him of crushing dissent, and regional strongmen feared losing their independence. This was not a calm state rebuilding after crisis, it was a tense balance held together by one man who had already survived an assassination attempt and expected more. Historians describe this period as one of consolidation mixed with repression, but behind every political decision was a simple calculation: who might try to kill me next, and how do I stay one step ahead? Zog rarely traveled without escorts. He varied his schedule unpredictably and kept information about his movements tightly controlled, yet even layers of security could not erase the atmosphere of conspiracy. Albania in the 1920s was influenced by neighboring Yugoslavia, Italy, and internal revolutionary movements, and each had reasons to prefer a different ruler. Plots formed in cafes in border towns and in foreign capitals. Some were amateur, some were serious, some never advanced beyond talk, but the volume of hostility around him was constant, and documented diplomatic reports from the era repeatedly mentioned fears for his safety and rumors of planned attacks. While exact details of every failed attempt are debated by historians, the pattern is not: he lived under near permanent threat and responded by tightening his grip on the state in 1925 he formally became president of Albania, a step toward greater authority but not yet a crown. Still, the elevation did not bring safety. It raised the stakes. A president can be replaced, a king is harder to remove without violence, and Zog was moving steadily in that direction. He reshaped the army's centralized power and reduced the influence of regional leaders, all rational steps for state building but dangerous ones for a man already seen as a target. Every reform meant someone lost status, money or influence, and those losses often turned into motives. By the late 1920s Albania was more stable on the surface. Roads improved, institutions formed, foreign relations expanded, yet the stability depended heavily on the continued survival of one individual, and everyone knew it, including Zog himself. This awareness shaped his personality. He became more cautious, more controlled, and more isolated from ordinary political life. He trusted a small inner circle and relied on personal loyalty as much as formal authority, because paperwork cannot stop a bullet and titles cannot block a doorway when an attacker decides to step through. And as 1928 approached, the next transformation loomed. He would not remain president, he would become something far more symbolic, far more visible, and far more tempting to those who had already tried and failed to end his life. A crown was waiting, and with it a larger target than ever before. In September 1928 Ahmed Zog made the boldest move of his life. He transformed a fragile republic into a monarchy and crowned himself King Zog I of Albania. It was a dramatic shift in title, but an even greater shift in danger. A president can step down, a king becomes a symbol, and symbols attract both loyalty and hatred. The coronation was meant to project stability, continuity, and national identity, yet beneath the ceremony lay a harsher truth. Every enemy he had made over the previous decade now saw not just a politician but a monarch standing in their way. Historians note that his decision followed European models of constitutional monarchy, but Albania was not Britain or Belgium. It was still a young state with deep divisions and armed traditions of settling disputes outside institutions. By placing a crown on his head, Zog also placed a brighter mark on himself inside the country. Some welcomed the monarchy, hoping it would bring order and recognition abroad. Others viewed it as a power grab by a man who had already centralized authority. The opposition did not vanish, it adapted. Former political rivals went underground, exiled figures criticized him from abroad, and regional networks quietly preserved their influence while watching for opportunity. Zog responded with further security measures. Palace guards expanded, intelligence services monitored dissent, and travel plans remained closely guarded. He understood that visibility was now unavoidable. Public ceremonies, diplomatic meetings, and state events increased his exposure. Each appearance required careful planning and layered protection, yet danger did not only come from within Albania. The Balkans were a region of competing ambitions. Italy under Mussolini sought influence across the Adriatic. Yugoslavia watched its southern borders carefully, and other European powers treated Albania as a small but strategic piece on a larger board. Zog had to balance foreign relationships without appearing controlled by any single power, a difficult task that created suspicion on all sides. If he leaned too close to Italy, critics accused him of dependence. If he resisted pressure, he risked losing support and provoking hostility. This diplomatic tightrope added an international dimension to the threats around him. Foreign intelligence reports from the late 1920s describe Albania as politically fragile and its ruler as both determined and vulnerable. The king himself became a symbol of whether the country would remain independent or fall under stronger influence, and symbols tied to national direction often become targets for those who want a different outcome. During this period, several plots were rumored and some uncovered before they could unfold. Details vary across sources, but the pattern of vigilance is clear. Guards intercepted suspicious individuals, security protocols tightened, and the king limited unscheduled contact with crowds. He traveled with protection and frequently altered routines to reduce predictability. Still, no system is perfect, and history would soon prove that even beyond Albania's borders, even in cities considered safe even under international eyes, someone was willing to try again. The stage for the most famous attempt on his life was forming, not in Tirana, not in a remote mountain pass, but in the heart of Europe, in a city known for diplomacy, culture, and imperial history, Vienna, where in 1931 gunfire would once again follow the man who seemed unable to escape it, and where survival would depend not only on guards or planning but on his own split-second reaction to danger coming from just a few steps away. By 1931 King Zog had ruled Albania for 3 years as a monarch and had already lived through more political violence than many rulers faced in a lifetime. Yet the next attempt on his life would unfold far from Tirana, far from his palace guards, and far from the familiar terrain where he controlled every layer of security. Vienna at the time was a major European capital, a place of diplomacy, culture, and relative order, not a battlefield and not a Balkan power struggle. Yet it became the setting for one of the most dramatic and Well-documented assassination attempts against a sitting monarch of the interwar period. In February 1931, Zog was visiting the Austrian capital accompanied by his entourage. The trip was official and public appearances were part of the schedule, which meant exposure, movement and moments that could not be fully controlled despite precautions. On the day of the attack, as he was entering the Vienna State Opera, two Albanian émigrés approached and opened fire at close range. The attackers were connected to political opposition circles hostile to his rule and saw the visit as a rare chance to strike outside the tighter security of Albania. Shots rang out in front of a major cultural institution in the middle of a European city, instantly turning a formal outing into an international incident. What happened next is one of the most striking elements of the story. According to contemporary reports, Zog did not freeze, he reacted. He drew his own pistol and returned fire while his guards moved to shield him. In the confusion, he was not killed and the attackers were stopped. The exchange was brief, chaotic and shocking to witnesses, but its consequences were enormous. Newspapers across Europe reported that a king had been attacked in Vienna and had personally fired back. The image of a monarch engaged in a street gunfight was extraordinary and reinforced his reputation as a ruler constantly under threat. Austrian authorities arrested the assailants and an investigation followed, revealing the political motivations behind the attempt and the networks that had supported them diplomatically. The event strained relations and drew attention to the instability surrounding Albania's leadership. For Zog, it confirmed a hard truth: distance did not equal safety, even outside his country, even under foreign protection. The danger followed him. The Vienna attempt became the most famous but not the only moment when his life hung in the balance. Security around him tightened further after 1931. Travel plans became even more restricted and public exposure was reduced where possible, yet ruling a state required visibility and contact, and each necessary appearance carried risk. Inside Albania, tensions did not disappear. Economic pressures, political opposition and the influence of larger powers continued to create an environment where conspiracy felt possible. The king, who had survived parliament gunfire and now bullets on a Viennese street, returned home with his legend growing, but so did the determination of those who wanted him removed. Survival made him stronger symbolically, yet it also proved to enemies that attempts were possible, that proximity could be achieved, and that history sometimes turns on a few seconds of surprise and reaction. As the 1930s advanced, a new and even larger threat began to overshadow individual plots: the ambitions of fascist Italy under Mussolini, a force that would not rely on a single gunman but on an entire army. And once again, Zog's survival would depend on timing, decisions and the ability to escape when staying meant certain defeat. As the 1930s moved forward, the threats around King Zog shifted from individual conspirators to the pressure of a powerful neighbor. Italy under Benito Mussolini had long sought influence over Albania through loans, advisors and political leverage. At first the relationship appeared cooperative. Italy provided financial support and Albania gained a degree of stability, but dependence created vulnerability, and Mussolini's ambitions in the Balkans grew more open as Europe edged toward another war. For Zog, this was a different kind of danger, not a hidden pistol but a state with an army, navy and air force capable of deciding Albania's fate. In April 1939 the pressure turned into action. Italian forces invaded Albania in a swift operation that overwhelmed resistance. The king faced a decision that no bodyguard could solve: stay and risk capture, or leave and preserve the possibility of a future return. He chose exile, departing the country with his family and part of the government. This moment is often portrayed as an end, yet for Zog the pattern of being targeted did not disappear, it simply followed him into a different phase of life. In exile he moved through Greece, Turkey, Britain and later Egypt, never regaining his throne but never fully escaping the political weight of his name. Monarchs in exile can become symbols for resistance, restoration or rivalry, and symbols still attract enemies. The war reshaped Europe, alliances shifted, regimes fell, and Albania itself experienced occupation and later communist takeover under Enver Hoxha, which closed the door on Zog's return but did not erase the earlier chapters of his life. By this point he had survived internal revolts, armed political attacks, public shootings abroad and the collapse of his kingdom without being killed by the violence that defined his era. Historians looking back note that while the exact number of assassination plots discussed in various sources differs, there is no doubt he lived for years under repeated credible threats and multiple direct attempts on his life. Few 20th century monarchs spent such a long period navigating both domestic conspiracies and international danger and remaining alive through all of it. Exile brought its own challenges: reduced resources, fading influence and the slow realization that the political world he had shaped was gone. Yet even in this quieter phase his past followed him. He remained a figure discussed in diplomatic circles, a former king whose survival had once affected regional balance and whose story illustrated how fragile power could be in a small state surrounded by larger ambitions. In the end, the man who had dodged bullets in parliament, returned fire in Vienna, and escaped an invasion by leaving at the right moment did not fall to an assassin's plan. His death in 1961 came not from political violence but from illness, a striking contrast to the hazards he had faced for decades. The enemies who tried to remove him by force failed time and again, while the ordinary limits of human life succeeded, and that is the final irony of King Zog I of Albania, a ruler who spent years expecting to be killed by others yet ultimately met the same quiet ending as countless people who never had to travel with guards or watch every doorway. History often celebrates dramatic deaths on battlefields or in revolutions, but sometimes the more unusual story is survival itself, and the reminder that power, danger and fate do not always follow the endings anyone expects. History often gives dramatic endings to dramatic lives. Yet the story of King Zog I closes in a quieter and more ironic way. After surviving years of political hatred, armed uprisings, assassination plots, and at least 2 clearly documented shooting attempts, he did not die in a palace corridor or on a city street. He did not fall during a coup or foreign invasion. He outlived the era that tried to destroy him. After fleeing Albania in 1939, he spent the rest of his life in exile, moving between countries as Europe reshaped itself. Through war, occupation and new regimes, his throne was never restored, and Albania eventually disappeared behind the isolation of a communist government. But the former king remained alive, a living reminder of a turbulent chapter in Balkan history. The man, once described as one of the most threatened rulers in Europe, grew older, away from the battlefield of politics. His daily life no longer revolved around motorcades and shifting routes, but the weight of exile is its own kind of pressure he carried. The loss of his country and the knowledge that he would likely never return as monarch. Yet even stripped of power, his past never fully loosened its grip. Historians still examined his rule, diplomats still remembered his balancing act between larger powers, and journalists still retold the stories of the parliament shooting and the gunfire in Vienna, because survival against repeated attempts on his life had become part of his identity. In 1961 in France, King Zog died at the age of 65 from illness, not from violence, not from revenge, and not from the political enemies who had once tracked his every movement. The contrast is striking. A ruler who prepared for bullets, lived through revolutions, and watched empires collapse ultimately faced the same quiet human limits as anyone else. No bodyguard can block time, no strategy can outmaneuver mortality, and no crown can negotiate with the end that comes for all people. This is the final lesson of his life. Power can attract danger, survival can build legend, but history does not always end stories in the way tension suggests. Sometimes the greatest twist is not a dramatic fall but a long escape from it. King Zog I did not become famous for a glorious victory or a tragic execution. He became unforgettable because history tried to remove him again and again, and each time he walked away until the only opponent left was life itself. And that is the paradox at the heart of his story. The king death could not catch was never defeated by his enemies, only by time. In the decades after he lost his throne, King Zog I remained a figure suspended between history and exile, a monarch without a kingdom yet never fully erased from European memory. While Albania passed through occupation, war, and then decades of rigid communist isolation under Enver Hoxha, the former king lived far from the country whose politics had once revolved around his survival. His name was banned inside Albania for years, his rule officially condemned, and his legacy rewritten. But outside the borders, historians, diplomats and journalists continued to reference the strange reality that one of the most politically threatened rulers of the interwar Balkans had not died by violence at all. He had survived the gunfire in parliament, he had survived the attack in Vienna, he had survived revolts, plots and the collapse of his regime, and he had escaped a full-scale invasion by leaving at the precise moment. Staying would likely have meant capture or death. This pattern of narrow escapes became the central thread of his historical image, not a conqueror, not a reformer of global scale, but a man who repeatedly slipped past the moment where others fell. Historians still debate the exact number of assassination plots because records from a small and unstable state are never perfectly complete, yet there is broad agreement that multiple serious attempts occurred and that he lived for years in conditions where sudden death was a realistic expectation rather than a distant fear. What makes his story endure is not only the danger but the contrast between expectation and outcome. Europe in the early 20th century was filled with leaders who were killed by bombs, bullets or coups, kings, presidents, prime ministers and archdukes whose lives ended violently and abruptly. Zog moved through the same era under similar threats and yet reached old age. In comparison to many of his contemporaries, his survival feels statistically unlikely, almost like a historical anomaly, and that anomaly shaped how later generations viewed him after the fall of communism in The 1990s Albania reopened to the world and began reassessing its past. The monarchy period, once dismissed entirely, started to be studied with more nuance, and Zog returned to public discussion not just as a ruler but as a symbol of a lost chapter in national development. In 2012 his remains were returned to Albania and reinterred in Tirana, a moment that symbolically closed the long arc of exile and partial erasure. The king, who had fled under invasion and died abroad, finally came home decades later, carried not by soldiers or conspirators but by ceremony and historical reconsideration. This return did not erase controversies about his rule. Debates about authoritarian methods, political repression and foreign dependence remain part of the scholarly conversation, yet even critics acknowledge the extraordinary personal danger that surrounded his years in power and the unusual fact that he survived it. The lesson of his life is not that fate protects rulers or that power guarantees safety. It is almost the opposite. Power can make a person the center of storms they did not fully choose, and survival can depend on instinct, timing, loyal allies, and sometimes pure chance. King Zog I stands in history as a reminder that the most dramatic story is not always how someone died but how long they managed to stay alive when so many forces were aligned against them. A king repeatedly targeted by history, who kept stepping aside just in time until history itself moved on and left him to face the only ending no guard can prevent and no enemy can accelerate: the quiet human ending that comes not from conspiracy but from time.